Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Aksa Taylor, Senior Director of Product Marketing at Abstract Security. Joined with me today is Alex Gilelach. He has a lot of experience with data operations, and I'm looking forward to interviewing him live. There were no scripts. We didn't rehearse this or prepare this. So it's just going to be a conversation with Alex, his background, and why he was motivated to contribute to our ebook on data strategy. Hi, Alex. Thank you for joining me. Could you introduce yourself in a few words?
Hi, Aksa. Good to meet you. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute. My background in cybersecurity started with a SIEM implementation back in late 2009. And I started with ArcSight deployments at a global hotel company. And the interesting part to me was it was something new to me, and B, we were highly distributed multiple data centers globally, and the requirement was to collect the logs and from that traffic select events to escalate to the SOC. So it's a very early on iteration of SIM in terms of deployments, but something I learned from that is kind of the complexity that goes with it and the scaling that's required, the tuning over time, and the time it took. Essentially, it was a long year. And I've since then been engaged in other deployments from more open source driven, more DevOps type deployments that I've learned that are actually more useful in the sense of the features that you can deploy tailored to the specific company or client. And so I've evolved my thinking on SIM quite a bit. And I've since moved on. My current role is cyber threat intelligence, but I still stay plugged in with logging because I believe it's a fundamental requirement to meet cybersecurity needs. And so I always look into the SIM space with interest and expectation that it's improving over time. And I'm always interested in how different folks, what solutions are deployed, how they're meeting both requirements to be compliant with standards, but also making their security operations more effective.
So you started really early with your ArcSight experience, when SIM was still like a conversation. And obviously you've seen SIM, next gen SIM, XDRs, they've evolved so much over time. So can you tell me a little bit about what your hands-on experience has been with this evolution of the platforms compared to your experience in the beginning to like now, the platforms that exist? Are there still challenges in this industry related to that logging platforms? How have they evolved? What's your experience been?
Yeah, and I started as a essentially deployment engineer, and the responsibilities I had were to get the SIM off the ground, so to speak, in scoping the log sources, in creating integrations to pull the data, normalizing the data, providing context through enrichment, through automation, and then generating events for the SOC. So at the time, my first deployment, my client was the Security Operations Center. I was an engineer, sole engineer assigned to this task. And over time, the next deployment was a little bit more focused on normalization, I would say, of the data, because we have more folks then dedicated to the data aspects, the computing aspects, the alert logic. So I think what I saw initially was SIM was advertised as something that is quite, I wouldn't say easy to deploy, but fairly reasonable effort relative to others. And what I learned was that the type of specialization required to make it effective was actually a lot broader. So one of the conversations I had midway through my SIM career, so to speak, was about what kind of skill sets are required, and what I've learned early on is quite different than what I see today. And just to summarize it, the early on, as I mentioned, a single engineer taking a look at a off-the-shelf tool to bring in data to normalize it and correlate data and create alerts, then became more of a development project, more of a data project. Now, with addition of machine learning and things like that, you're adding the analytics to that. So I think it has evolved significantly, and my role has, evolved. Now I'm a consumer of it, so I don't nowadays engage a lot with logging hands-on. But I started as an engineer, progressed into more of part of the larger team of engineers. And then the last engagement I had was about making the selections between products, services to encompass, like you mentioned, XDR. So a lot of places have evolved from solving the larger issue, which is continuous monitoring, where SIEM is a part of that solution. So that includes the tooling, the staffing, etc. So the last engagement I had specific to SIEM that was hands-on was selecting from off-the-shelf SIEM, whether it's on premises or cloud, then picking a services provider, scoping the type of engagement that we hired them to do. And that was at a large financial institution, and we were highly regulated then. In my current role, I am engaged not as a responsible party, but someone who's contributing to the roadmap for logging and monitoring as it pertains to, again, continuous monitoring and how the assets that we have, what kind of logs we need for what types of use cases to drive, detections and incident response. So it's evolved, again, hands-on first as an engineer, and I still have affinity for that because I still fundamentally want to know how something works. So one of the things I watched, and something we frequently discuss in these circles, is how the skill set that was seen years back has evolved. And I think if I can make a way of saying it, is that we went from someone who was specializing in some deployment to now more of a developer type skill set, or an integration type skill set, or a data analytics skill set that you see prevalent in the space. And of course, it's augmented by other folks that are either cloud specialists or more the infrastructure folks. So it's a lot more common to see a team of folks. And if I were back to hands-on work in that space, most likely I would go after the enrichment side or bring in context, because I currently do threat intelligence. And I think that's where I could contribute the most, is making sure that the login environment contains feeds from threat intelligence to provide that sort of risk context for data that's being ingested.
Mm. And you mentioned that earlier in your career, when you were the person, the deployment person responsible, the normalization, this enrichment, you did it yourself, like manually. So
Right.
there is like, was there a gap in tooling or platforms, or did you use multiple tools and platforms? Do organizations, in your experience, use the SIEM platforms or SIEM plus XDR? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and just that, again, just to hone in on the data aspects and then the normalization aspects. I did have background in database management, and that's one of the reasons the CISO at the time selected me for the role. And I used those skills to essentially treat the subset of this effort as a data warehouse type of exercise, or then it became ETL, etc. But in a classical sense, normalization was taking the data and integration, some of them hand bolt, because I've not run into a single instance of SIEM deployment where all types of data feeds are readily available off the shelf then. And that meant we had to build custom integrations, right? So some of the tooling that I managed as a security engineer happened to be well versed in. We actually hand developed integration. So there was a lot of work. Most of the time was spent on actually that, which was rewarding, because at the end of the exercise, we had the data that we wanted to have, and it was normalized, and it fit the model we were trying to build to normalize the data. Unfortunately, looking at it from a perspective of user, or the security operations center, the idea or the requirement they had, the primary requirement was that there's alerting and there's events going to the SOC that are actionable. So those two things don't necessarily match. And I will say, one of the lessons learned for me from normalization and data hauling and things like that was to first focus on the use cases and focus on the outcomes of the data ingestion rather than the ingestion itself. And I think a lot of folks go through that exercise, and it's absolutely has to be done. But one piece of advice I always have, since my career progression was to focus on the sort of the end user and build the user stories from that perspective, rather than looking at this as a data hauling, data warehousing exercise. In that sense, you could demonstrate ROI sooner in your delivery than later, because the larger the environment, the more time it takes to bring the data in. So you could end up in a place where you're bringing a lot of data without a lot of value to it.
That's right. And the noisy data, I mean, your actual threats are buried in the noise and harder to get to. So you're actually in a very interesting space because your current role is incident response or incident leading the security teams, but also your backbone is still the data because that's how you make use of the data to create your policies. Do you notice, well, you are unique because you already had a data background, so probably an easier for you to work with teams to get the data that you want. Do you think organizations struggle with that bridge between security needs, and the data teams who are responsible for bringing in, like you said, now we have teams that manage data operations.
Mhm.
There is there's a gap or a bridge that's difficult. What's your thought?
Yeah, yeah. There's definitely a opportunity to define roles around and expectations that this is somewhat a unique use case. Again, going back to this is not just a plain data warehouse or ETL or exercise for analytics, because security is a bit different. So I think what you mentioned is key, was just having those two teams build a bridge and have clear expectations of the definition of good, and the use case being the two things typically discussed are, one, alerting, the other one is basically being able to search and hunt in the logs. And the way you meet those isn't the same, in terms of data models, etc. The other aspect too to think about is data governance. There's a lot of difference in the types of data the security handles, and a lot of things to be aware depending on the industry that folks are in or the type of compliance they're trying to meet. There are pretty hard spelled out standards when it comes to retention, when it comes to privacy concerns, labor laws, et cetera, et cetera. So those aren't typically things that a data warehouse folks consider unless they're named up front. So I think, to the point you raised, is definitely have the bridge between the teams established. I will also say adopt more iterative or DevOps approach, so that there is, as you go along this journey, you see the type of data that's being brought, and then you can triage whether or not it meets the criteria, but also meets the compliance requirements and data handling compliance requirements. Again, not typical, right? Or not the primary objective, but for security folks, that's always in the back of our mind. Is yeah, we could in theory collect all the data on all activities, and besides running into capacity issues, we're definitely going to run into compliance and data management issues with that approach. So I think build a bridge and then establish rules around data handling and classification and things like that is what I would do up front. So those are, in my mind, those are some of the items on the checklist to make sure there's common goals.
And you mentioned data governance, which is such a hot topic right now with, everything being digitalized, your identity, your assets, your essentially your virtual life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Own everything you have, is out there in cloud, is out there as a digital asset. And so there's even more stress on the privacy and security organizations, countries, the government taking not control, but applying regulations on top of the industry regulations, the compliance needs or the audit requirements, like SEC for US, the GDPR policies, the European policies. So what for let's take example with the SEC in US and saying that, hey, within 4 days you have to report on a data breach or a breach that's materialistic. So
Mm-hmm.
such timelines, do you see that people on higher level, like CISOs, who are not involved in the day-to-day operations, but do have the liability, the responsibility for reporting and pulling that data as necessary? How mature do you think organizations are with these growing demands for security and regulations? Do you think most organizations, does the size of the organization matter? Or what are the things that matter, I guess?
Yep. And a quick note on your comment on data handling, and there are, and just from my recent experience, it is one of the factors that can determine a purchase decision, because there are some companies that are very well versed in this space. I would always recommend to speak to folks that are, if you are also in the highly regulated environment, because I've seen demos of tools quite recently, just happen to have seen demos of tools that, in my mind, and just the brief assessment looking at it, would not be able to pass GDPR.
Mm,
And again, it's to that balance of the types of data you can collect and store, but
mm,
unless an organization have gone through an assessment and determined what works, there are some tools that actually aren't conducive. That's a quick comment. But besides that, in terms of maturity, I think, at least among my peers, we're seeing a lot of strides made towards disclosing events. And not just for the sake of a regulation. The regulation is fairly aggressive. The intent behind the regulation is to protect the consumers in our case. So I appreciate that. And it is putting the stakes on the ground that says something must be reported, and that something is a definition of what's material to the company. And once that report is made, the evidence that supports that determination of something being material is key to be able to defend it. So back to the importance of logging in this sense, it would be from a more of a forensic perspective, to make sure that the logs are put together in a way that, quote unquote, you can take to court, is key. Right. So in that sense, it's the requirement would be logs are there, and the speed with which they're made available to the analyst, so that analysts can make a decision as to materiality of the event and classify it properly is key. And again, that's additional. That's something that came from regulation. I think analysts have always wanted to be able to have data that gives them the answer as quick as possible, but now we have timelines. And if you think about the incident response in a broader sense from a company's perspective, there's so many steps to that. And if each step takes greater than a certain amount of time, then you're going to run out of those 72 hours. So I would say it's definitely changed how folks see continuous monitoring,
right.
where something in the past, you could take a week to QA a set of events or incidents, perhaps, on an interval, to make sure that things are done properly. Now there is a use case that says we have to be able to decide and be able to defend a decision very quickly, a matter of hours. And if you think about weekends, the worst case scenario is something happens Friday afternoon, late Friday, you really don't have till that many days to work something out. So, to your point, it's definitely a requirement where folks have to disclose or be able to, even if it's internal. Some CISOs are very specific about the types of data they want escalated and see and be able to make decisions. Either case, the speed with which the analyst has the data to support the decision is key. So it's no longer we have 1,000 alerts to weed through, and at the end of that, we have some once a week QA. It has to be almost real-time detections and real-time alerting and escalation. So that's very real. I think, to your maturity question, I do see a lot of strides being made, and folks specifically calling that out, starting from the kind of the corporate level incident response that involves a broader set of teams. So, your legal, et cetera, and then cyber being a subset of that. And cyber is definitely required to act fast and in a defendable way in that.
hmm And talking about speed, like I'm curious to learn also then the data storage and retention part of it, because if you are collecting all your data in kind of like the same tier of storage, then is it going to be in a more expensive, like faster disks for processing times and retrieval when you need that? Because as you mentioned, speed of access and speed of reporting on data is so critical. Or then if you want larger retentions and try to save costs, then you're looking at cheaper disks, but that means longer query responses. Or our organizations and maybe personal experience, how you've designed it. You've kept like warm, hot, real time kind of like storage tiers. How did you do that?
Yeah, from personal experience, and again back to data management, we made a determination, my first pass at SIM, that there are two types of queries. One is, as you mentioned, the real time. One is the more historical or forensic use case. And so we have to decide how much data do we need for the real time
Mhm.
searching. And I think it is this early on, we made a decision. I think we had 10 days or 7 days at the time that says, this is what I need. This is my minimum. I'm going to store that on the fastest storage I have available with the most compute I would need to support that alert and the contextual search. So basically, the scenario is an alert comes out, and an analyst would then bring additional context as needed to support the decision to be made. And we found that typically that was either 7 or 10 days, I can't recall. And a different use case that goes, have I seen this before? This being some sort of indicator of compromise or a log entry that could take, a batch job to run, and that's okay to say this might take an extended period of time. And in that sense, the quality, is of higher priority than not. So the time can take longer. So what we ended up doing in two of the places we were deployed SIM is we had two separate storage environments and two separate compute environments, one specific to each of those use cases. Because what we found, if combined, neither one of those use cases were very easy to meet or feasible to meet. Right. So you basically topple your logging environment by a query that says I only need 7 days, but I have to search, months and months, and vice versa. It doesn't make sense to try and spit up a query that goes back 2 years. I can wait on the response. So yeah, both places where I was hands-on deploying logging environments, we ended up splitting requirements based on the type of query, profiling the query, profiling how many users need concurrent, access to run the queries. Can something run in the background, et cetera, et cetera. So we had like a criteria that almost built like a purpose-built data. So again, the normalization was done in the same tier, but then when it came to storage, it was based on the type of the query we're in. The only other thing I'll say too to add is the retention requirements can differ for different compliance frameworks. So if one compliance framework says I need 10 years of data, it makes financial sense to store that on the cheapest possible storage because you still get to comply with the framework and you could still search data. It'll be slow, but it meets the requirement, right? Otherwise, you end up just kind of not using the resources to the extent they can be. So I would focus high performing resources to the queries that are real time, and I would focus the cheaper end of the resources, for the batch or longer term searching.
Mhm. Absolutely. And that's something that we talk to, I mean, talking to other peers as well from organizations, we see that people are realizing it more and more because data volumes are growing. The everything like the not just data volumes because of handling more data, but because even the applications, there is so much flexibility in how you deploy applications. If you want to go with microservices, then you're looking at hybrid clouds, hybrid platforms. So there is data coming in from variable different environments that you're trying to manage in a central place. Let's talk about the book. So Can you tell me what your personal motivation was? What your objective was behind contributing to this data strategy book? What did you have in mind, or why did you decide to contribute to this?
I mentioned earlier having interest in SIEM. It was something that I started in cybersecurity with. My first engagement with cyber when I moved out of technology was SIEM deployment.
Mhm.
And the things that I found were lacking and the things that I found were excelling at the time just kept my interest. Since then, I always thought, is there a solution to all these problems that I've encountered? And how do we iterate as an industry? Because again, it's a fundamental function that cyber needs.
Mhm.
And I think all the tools evolve, right, over time. But for SIM, it's just the really the first tool that I picked up in cybersecurity career-wise, and I've kept up with developments. I have a lot of folks that I know that lead SIM practices in various places. So it's just something that's of interest to me because I think there's still challenges that were identified, a long time ago, and there are different deployments, and it's one of those things that I think still needs to be iterated a few times. And I think it does grow over time, and now with addition of machine learning AI, there's a whole other layer of requirements and expectations that's being added to it. I saw this other similar kind of thing happening with the SOAR environment, how that came to be, and that's evolved, right? So I like to see these tools evolve to as much usability as possible, and I do like solution design. So I think same as it's just a very broad market that encompasses a lot of disciplines in it, and I like to look at it to see how it can evolve further.
Mhm.
And the last bit of all the AI and ML being added to it, I it kind of got me excited and thinking about it again, and kind of how does that help solve the issues we saw, different deployments.
Yeah. And what are the challenges that someone who's trying to implement a data strategy, like trying to start, what are some things that you think reading this book can help or address them with, like maybe from your learnings, as we brainstorm in our weekly sessions and as we're progressing with the book, we've had so many people mention like, oh, what not to do kind of things. So are there certain like what not to do's that we captured in this book that you think our readers would really benefit from?
I think so. I think the book is comprehensive, and I think there are themes in the book that will stand out to each reader that may help with their individual challenges. I think overall, what I typically advise on when it comes to SIM is it is a complex environment.
Mhm.
It is encompassing of your platforms, from network through compute, through data storage, through data handling. It is a rather complex environment. When I deployed my first SIM, we went to the data center to take a look at all the equipment we purchased, and it was really really astonishing to see that the amount of gear we purchased to meet SIM almost matched our global warehouse, footprint. It was
Wow.
very very interesting, and thinking, okay, here's one solution that brings millions of dollars of revenue. Here's another solution that helps us meet PCI compliance, for instance. Right, both are important. One has a definite ROI to the business. The other one's a cost center. So I think thinking of cost is still valid, and I think efficiency is how you get there. And I think there's a lot of lessons learned that folks have put into the book that you only learn if you deploy it. And
Mhm.
I always think about kind of what are the boundaries to this, right? This is not a perpetual data exercise, right? This is unlike, I'm thinking, if I wanted to predict the weather, what kind of warehouse I would build. It would probably be a research project. It would be a little bit less practical for threat detection. So I think of SIM, and I think of definitely costs, definitely the skill sets. I think is key to understand what type of skill sets are required. So one of the things, if I was reading your book, I would say look at the technologies that are involved, and see how your skill sets map to those to make the decisions of the type of folks you need to have to make it successful. And there's a lot to that, just in itself. And also, it's not going to be one individual or one team. It's most likely, back to your earlier point, like a cross team exercise.
Right.
So I think the book makes it obvious that it needs to be a lot of cross team collaboration, a lot of shared requirements and deliverables, including governance. And I think it makes those points. And personally, if I had to zero in on something as a leader, I would say, what types of folks do I hire, or what types of services do I hire to make this successful? And hopefully the book makes that point, even by listing the playbooks and guides and things like that. I would start looking at the resources that it requires. That's
Absolutely.
just one example.
Yeah, I think, and the best part for me working with all of you, the contributors, is that this is all based on like real life experiences. It's not just a theoretical or hypothetical thing. You guys have worked, you all have worked on it hands-on. You have learned these lessons practically from your experience and shared that in this book. So I'm really excited for it to be launched so that our readers and viewers can learn from and be better prepared as they design their strategy. Now, what about, and you kind of touched on this, you touched on leaders and how it helps people, the leaders know what kind of team members they need, what kind of team skills they need. Apart from that, what advice would you give to CISOs who are kind of like the arch, everything kind of rolls back to them as they're reading this book? What are some things that you would like to point out to them, not just within the context of the book, but as they're overall trying to think the data strategy, the steps, the fundamentals of it, the type of people they should hire or the skills they need to hire. What are some maybe things or bottlenecks they should watch out for as they're starting on this journey?
I would say, just like any complex project, a lot of thought has to be given to the dependencies, critical paths. I would take a lot of time to scope. I don't know if it was Einstein's quote that said, I want to spend 95% of the time thinking about the problem and 5% solving. So I would advise that in making sure that the scope is very clearly defined and the dependencies are very clearly defined, because before you start iterating, SIM can be very costly very quickly and still not meet the baseline, requirements of what people expect.
Right.
And again, it's something that's been around for, over a decade. And at this point, you would think there would almost be a template. But I think that template is what a CISO needs to develop, right? They need to think through, why am I doing this? What is my table stakes?
Mhm.
And then how do they relate with other things? And also, I would say, SIM does what it does in the detection space, in the identifications of threats and
Mhm.
things like that. But think about other bits and pieces of security, because I've had experience with sort of SIM taking the central stage
Mhm.
for security operations, and that's fair. But just to consider, things that protect your environment directly, as well, right? To say SIM is a subset of security operations. It's not the one tool that will make it or break it. And
Right.
in that regard, I think there could be a lot of conflict between, or a way to set priorities between prevention tools and detection tools. So, CISOs are looking across their programs. They have to be mindful of prevention, right before or in addition to detection. So I would say clearly defined scope, and dependencies, because it's a multi-domain solution,
Mhm.
is probably what I would say is critical for CISOs, and definition of use cases, what it solves for and who's going to consume it, and all that detail is probably what I would say to focus on.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think you mentioned rightly on how there could be a rush to action, the 95% thinking and 5% action, especially in today's world when there's always something new, like AI, blockchain, Web3, and how do you secure against this? Quantum and quantum
Yeah,
cryptography, like change your certifications because oh, your encryption might be broken for the quantum supercomputer. So there's always like this next thing, this next thing, this
yeah,
next for security leaders, but sometimes organizations struggle with fundamentals like, hey, don't expose to internet with bad creds, just
right.
fundamental things that you should take
Yeah,
into. So I think what you mentioned is that the planning part of it is so important before the leaders jump into action, and also with the vendor, all the vendors and all the
yeah,
tools, the crowded messaging. You need this, you need that, a new acronym for something, the CNAPs, the SOARs, the next gens. So yeah, definitely rightly pointed on how planning is like the bigger part of the cycle. And I hope that's what the readers of our book take away from this, that we've joined our brains from industry experts like Alex to make that planning part easier for you with all the learnings that we have. And thank you so much, Alex, for contributing from your experience to this book and also for this interview. I think there's really neat and very important things that you pointed out in this conversation that I hope will be useful for the readers as they're designing their data strategy. Before we wrap up, are there any words, any conclusion words that you'd like to share with our readers as they begin to download this book or as we get ready to launch this book?
yeah. It's definitely looking forward to that, and definitely looking forward for feedback. I think most folks are accessible. If someone would like to reach out, I think there's various forums we all participate in terms of sharing. I would like for that to continue. I think this has been very engaging exercise, and I think this should keep us all plugged in and see the type of feedback we get. Perhaps there's follow-ups to this in a way that helps us continue sharing, and as new things come to fruition, new features that you mentioned or new ways of deploying. I think there's a lot of things that are going to continue evolving. So I would like to, you know, stay plugged in and keep sharing things learned, and hear from folks that read through the book and seeing how it helped them make decisions.
Absolutely. We're a community at the end of the day. Cybersecurity, we need each other and we need that knowledge and that expertise. It's not just about tools and products, but it's also about people. And I think people are such a strong part of security. So thank you, Alex, and thank you everyone for listening to us, for downloading the book, or for just wanting to contribute to the evolving volumes of our book as well in future. We look forward to helping teams evolve in their data strategy and continue to create assets that will help people in their journey. Thank you all.
Thank you.